So this is going to be another introduction to Blender, but specifically for modeling a character called Five Pebbles. And I'm doing this for my niece. So let me import the images. So first, before we do that, I want to go ahead and just sort of give an introduction to the Blender window layout. So right now I'm in the layout screen. There's tabs along here when you first open, and this is Blender 4.0. You can see if you go under the Blender icon over here and open it, you'll see Blender 4.02. That's the one I'm using. It's the latest version right now. And Blender is a little unusual in that it's got a lot of nested windows. And I've got everything blown up big so you can see the text. So there's actually some of these we won't use, some of these tabs, and we can get rid of them. We can close them if we wanted to, but I wanted to show it the way it comes in loaded by default. The other thing that's important to know is that I am using, and this will be different from a lot of tutorials that you see. You'll see I've got this screencast keys set up so I can go Control R or Control E, and it'll mimic my key commands when I'm doing it, so that as I'm doing something, you'll see Alt left mouse button allows me to rotate, and then middle, or it won't do a scroll, so I'm using my scroll wheel to do that. Alt right mouse does the same thing, and that's because I'm using, go under preferences, the key setup, Keymap, called industry compatible. When you first load Blender, there'll be an option for Blender keys in Blender 2.7x. Because I learned 3D on other software, and because a lot of game engines use different key commands, I don't like having to change my default keys for certain types of navigation, specifically what I just showed, which was the middle mouse Alt button for panning, the right mouse for zooming, and the left. There's a lot of functions that come with that other Blender key map, and you can, if you want to learn it that way, that's fine. But for me, because I use game engines and other tools like other 3D software, there's a reason why this key map is called industry compatible. It's because it uses similar keyboard shortcuts to some of the other apps in the industry. So if you're coming from Maya, if you're coming from Cinema 4D, the keys will be the same. Or if you're using some of the tools like Unity or Unreal Engine. Blender's default keys have a lot more keys mapped. They're slowly building up the industry compatible, but there's more things like a grab and a rotational arc tool and things like that you'll see in like the donut tutorial, for example, that are useful, but you can get by without them. And this going with these industry keys makes me go a little bit slower, which is also useful for a tutorial. Because if you get, I mean, yes, you can work really fast when you get used to if you just know all the keys in Blender. For me, doing this tutorial, going really fast isn't going to do you any favors. So I just wanted to point out that if you want to follow along and you want to be using the same key setup, you got to go under preferences, or when you first launch into Blender, and set this pull down to industry compatible. On top of that, I've modified one of the keys because this latest version 4.0 actually changed one of my key commands I use a lot, which is select link. So if you look under the name here and do select linked, you'll see where under a lot of these, it's Control L. I've gone and changed it under certain things like object mode, edit in object mode, to the bracket key, which is what it used to be. So just know that and I'll try to recall that out when I do it, when I'm doing the bracket key for my selections, I'll try to call out that it's also Control L under the new version, or you can go and set your keyboard commands for certain, like under edit mode here, to like if I select one of these vertices, for me, if I bracket, it selects linked. And if you look under here, you can select by a lot of different options down here. And I'll show how that works in a minute. But it's a way of like, if I drag across this right now, I've selected all the things that were visible, but it didn't select the back face. So, or the back vertex there. Another way to do that is to click on this little X-ray tool, this double X right here, and then drag select, and you can select through, or like what I did before, just select one of the vertices and hit bracket or Control L. Let me see if Control L still works, even though I've reset it. Nope. So that'll load up something else now because I've messed with my keys. But for you, if you haven't gone and customized it, Control L should do the selection. If you're using pre 4.0, like 3.6 Blender, then bracket should load up all of the, or select all the vertices. And what we're doing here is basically, let's say, let me do it real quick, split, and I want to select this by edges. I'll explain what I'm doing. I'll explain these things in a minute. I just want to show you the reasons for selecting these things like this. I'm going to mark this by seam. So now if I say, okay, I want to select, this is just a simple topology, right? We'll get into more complex ones as we build this robot out. But if I wanted to select all of these faces, but I only wanted to select the ones that are separated by the seam, if I hit bracket, now, because down here it's set by seam, I only select those faces that I've marked with the seam, which is useful for when you're wanting to do like selection sets for UVs, which we'll explain in a little bit as well. So there's all kinds of ways to do selections, and selections is one of the things you're going to do a lot in Blender. So I wanted to sort of show that. In addition, as you can see, I've gone into this. It's called edit mode. Another way to get into edit mode is with the under industry compatible keys with the two key. One is a way to select by vertices. I'm not sure what the key command for lines is. It'll say up here, Control. Nope. Sometimes when you roll over things, it'll give you the key command. So in object mode, well, you'll see up here, it's number 4. So if you hit 4, that's object mode. 2 is edit mode. 3 is for selecting face. 1, let's see, 4 is going back into object mode. They're all over the place. Anyway, I'm going to basically be doing it kind of manually with the mouse, so you don't have to worry about that. So right now, up here at the top, you've got File, which is where you would say a new file. You see this in all kinds of 3D programs. So there's the File menu for saving and doing other things, importing things. I'm going to show you how to import your example images to model from. And by the way, this is an add-on. A lot of things in Blender aren't turned on by default, and this is one of them. Images as planes. It may be turned on in 4.0 now. I'm not sure, but I'll show you how to turn it on if it's not. It ships with it. It's just not enabled by default. We'll get into that in a minute. And then, so we're in, that's the File menu. So you can go New, and we're going to make a new general, and that'll be for, and I don't want to save this because I'm just showing. General means 3D file. There'll be an option for 2D animation. There's a 2D animation feature in Blender. I don't know it very well, but you can learn it, and it is very useful. It's cool. There's a lot of tutorials on how to do that. I suggest learning how to do 3D stuff first and then getting into that, because you can technically, what you're doing there is you're actually doing 2D with 3D. It's a layout. So if we go into that, this is what it looks like, and you can draw, do sketches and draw, and then there's things for changing the way the drawing looks. So if you go under, I'm in draw mode. If I go under sculpt mode and I want to twist this, the line that I just drew, it's basically what's going on is I'm drawing this line in 3D, but I'm in a camera mode that makes it look like I'm drawing 2D, and I'm also drawing keyframes. So like if I draw another line, go back to draw mode and draw another line here like that, I've got these, I'm showing onion skin right now, but you can see how the line changes. So you can literally draw 2D animation, modify it. There's all kinds of styles of drawing that you can draw with, which are cool. You can modify those. I'm not going to get into the 2D stuff. It's there. If you're interested, go learn it. There's videos. There's people that know it way better than I do, so follow them. So if you want to do a sculpting, which is also 3D, but this is just a modified 3D, you notice how we have less tabs up here. It'll start with a different default geometry, in this case, a high-res sphere, and you can sculpt like clay. There's actually a clay strips brush here that's pretty cool for being able to like add strips of clay and block out shapes, and you can hold down smooth or the shift key and smooth it. We'll get into that a little bit maybe. Since we're doing a robot, we may not. There's some neat cloth features in here for clothing. Let me stretch this. If you grab the side of this menu bar, you can make it a double so you can see all of the functions. And one of them here is this cloth brush. And if we look at the kind of cloth that it's doing, you can kind of like add cloth folds to your sculpt. Now it's kind of low res sculpt, but and the type of cloth that you're adding is set here under. Right now it's deformation drag. If you set it to like inflate, it would be like blowing up a balloon, where it'll slowly inflate and then stretch that way. Just grab, so you can just drag and stretch. And anyway, expand. So I won't get into all that. Just wanted to show, like I said, I'm showing the different modes here under the types, the way you can do it. VFX is for compositing. I'm going to go ahead and just show that. It's a different setup. It's kind of like making video. And once you render something, you can add effects to it after the fact. I'm not going to go into that probably in any of these videos. There's other videos on the web for that. And then video editing, you can actually do video editing. So let's go back to general, the default. This is our default 3D setup. Notice it basically general just allows for everything. So like when I showed you sculpting, there's a sculpting tab here. It just starts, instead of starting with a sphere, it starts with this cube, because the default cube is what loads up in your general setup. Modeling is the same thing I showed you as edit mode. So if you go into modeling, notice it says up here edit mode in the pull down. So there's multiple ways to get at things. Again, sculpting right here, sculpt mode. You can go into that and you can sculpt. Notice that the icons on the left changed. So let me see what else we need here. So we talked about the new. This is where you would open a previously working version. Make sure you save often in case your computer crashes. Blender doesn't crash much, but it can. So when you've got to a place where you're happy with the work, save it. The other thing you'll notice, this layout mode here, um, is that it by default it also has this timeline bar down here. You'll notice I can grab and drag it. And what that is it's just a way to keyframe or see animation, because by default Blender does 3D modeling, but it's meant for animation. So so let's just say I wanted to animate this cube, and I hit W to bring up the widget so that I can move it on the left. And again, that's a default industrial key. That might be a different key setup for the default Blender keys. So if you hit W and you move this here, and then you can right click. We're not in animation mode, so you can't right click. So like all of these, if you right click, you get these contextual menus. Those are going to be based on which one of these tabs you're in. So under animation, notice there's the animation tab. You get this, you can see your animation from the camera view. There's a default camera right here that's placed in the scene. And this is what that view over here, this left, this plane, you can see there's the view from the camera. So if I modify that camera over here under the, get into explaining this in a little bit, but the camera options, and change the view angle, you can see the field of view and how it's kind of like zooming in and out on the cube, just like it would a real camera would. Now, if I want to keyframe this and animate it flying across the screen towards the camera, you go and set your keys here. So I want to animate the location, and right here, these little dots. I click on those. Notice it's created these 4 dots down here called object transforms, XYZ location. And now if I move my key over to my playback over here to the like frame 80, and then drag the cube there, notice that now I've got this green option because I basically animated it on the Y. I don't know why it changed the X as well and the Z, because I didn't really change those. Those basically haven't changed. The orange one has. If I key that, I can key these 2, and you notice that it set up these keys, and now I've got the in-betweens. So if I hit play, there's the animation. If I wanted to make it accelerate, I could select the keys, right click, and then change the interpolation mode to something like quadratic, so it'll accelerate in. See how it gets faster? And you can also do an easing mode where it's automatic, and you can do ease in and ease out, and that'll make it accelerate in and accelerate out. See how it kind of comes to a braking stop. Anyway, I'm not going to go into animation much. I just wanted to show that's what this little timeline down here is, and there's multiple ways to see the timeline. We won't go into that until a later video maybe. All right, so back to the layout tab up here. Let's pull this thing out of the way because we don't need it. So we've explained these tabs. We haven't explained them all. I'll get into those later, because right now, really, we only need to kind of play in the layout, the modeling, or editing, and maybe the sculpting. We'll get into UV editing in a later one. So that's really, these are the 3 places where you'll do a lot of the work. Over here on this side of the screen, you'll see that there's this little tab right here, or window, and it's basically a node-based view of the scene. So you can see you've got your camera. If I click on that, it selects it. Here's my cube. And you'll see I've added animation data to that cube. It's down nested under it. And then there's a light. And you don't see the effect of the light because right here in the top right here, there's a wireframe mode. I'm in a flat shaded kind of model mode. You can sculpt in or do whatever. And then there's the shaded mode. And the shaded mode will show a material if it's on the object or if it's on any object. So you can paint textures or whatever. If you select the object right here, this beach ball down here, notice it says material. If you go and you change that to red, now we've got our red material showing up on this cube. If I go back to the original view that I was in, the shaded, notice it doesn't show the red, right? So that's the difference, is like this shaded mode is just showing everything depending on how you want it to show. So you can show, if you have a bunch of objects in your scene, if it's a huge scene, you can make it so that it shows colors randomly by object. So let's show what that looks like. So theme. So if we show it by material, it'll show the different objects material. Now, material will also show here, but it's based on a different setting down at the bottom of materials. I don't want to go into that yet. So let's make a second cube, add mesh, or let's make a sphere, UV sphere. So there's that. And let's add a mesh to a cone. So now we've got 3 objects and they all look the same. Or let's add another cube. Now we got 2 cubes, and you see all those things up here in the different materials. I could add materials to those, but what if I wanted to have the same material on all of them? So if we go into material mode right now, I've got the red material on just this cube, but I want to apply it to this guy, this guy, and this guy. Great. Now I can't really tell which cube is different or which of these objects are different. And in a more complex scene, that starts to matter. In this one, it's not that much, but there is a way to see it or sort it so that you can kind of tell the scene and tell the individual objects apart differently. And that's by going to random here, and you notice that it'll automatically apply a different color to each object in the scene just by setting it to random. You can do it single, change it to whatever. But yeah, like this random is a way to do it so that if in a complex scene, you can actually, you'll see a lot of kind of multicolor scene setups. It's to show all of the objects in the scene and be able to pick like what's an individual object differently, because sometimes things will look like they're multiple objects. For example, if I go into this and then inside edit mode, if I add, let's say a cylinder, sorry, hit the mic. And then I take that cylinder and kind of just pull it here and do something like that. So now it looks like 2 different objects, but if you notice, they're still the same color because of the way I've got this thing rendering, and they move together because I added this cylinder inside of the sphere when I was editing it. So literally I was adding geometry that allows me to go and do different things with it, right? And this thing is still separate, so if I hit my bracket key, I can still pull it and separate it, right? So that's the difference, is like in edit mode, if you go and you add a bunch of geometry or topology or objects, they're all going to be joined together. We can separate them back out into individual parts if we just go while in edit mode and we've got this edit selected, we can go mesh, separate, and if you do by loose parts, notice we get a different color on one of them and we've busted it up. So now we have, in object mode, we have our parts selectable again, okay? So that's, these are the render modes. So you've got wireframe, what's it called? Viewport shading, which is basically like flat shading. It's a different type of shading. It's not final. You can't notice when you click on any of these, you get options for how that uh, viewport or that type of shading renders. So in this one, when I click on the arrow down here, I can change it to matte cap. I can change the type of matte cap. There's all kinds of functions. I'm not going to explain all those. I just wanted I'm just kind of giving you the highlights here to show you, like, we've got wireframe, viewport shading, material shading, so that we've got like the materials. They're all using the same material. In this case, if I wanted to change one of them, make it a different material, I could just delete its material here, make a new material, give it a different color. Now we've got a blue material. Make it metallic if I wanted to make it reflect or mirror like. I'll go into material properties later. And then the final one outside of this material mode is rendered mode. And what rendered mode will do is show you everything. And notice now we look like we get this lighting, because we do. Let me add a plane. And you'll notice we even have shadows. So there's render mode, and the light is coming from our light source here, so that as I move the light around, you can actually, and you can animate that as well. Shadows change. And you can change the type of light if you wanted to make it a sun. Its strength will be too much because it's going to be a sun. Usually it's like 1 in value. But it's a directional light now, so that as you just move it and point it around, it behaves like a sun. That you don't have to move. You can just change the direction of the light. A spot, it's going to be too low now because it's only 1 watt. It behaves more like a light bulb. So if we go up to like 200, notice we get a cone. We crank that up even more. The brighter the light, the farther you'll be able to see it shine. But that's the way a spot works. You can change the radius so the shadows get softer. See how it hardens up the shadow there. You can change the angle of the spot to make it brighter. So this would be kind of like a stage lighting, or maybe if you wanted to make headlights on a car or something like that. And then there's an area light, which is basically it's like a plane. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Yeah, there we go. And I want to go local because I've gone and rotated this. So an area light is like a window portal kind of light, where it comes from the shape of this thing, and you can change that shape to the disk if you wanted, so that as it shines, the shape of the light will change. An ellipse for scaling. And I've got it so bright you can't really tell because of the glow factor, but you can see where it takes the shape of that thing. So you can create like track lighting along a wall or whatever, usually with a square, and it will clip here. Anyway, that's the different lights. I'm getting into too much detail. The default, like I said, is going to be, it's going to come in as a point light, and that's just where you can go and you can add like whatever, however many of these you want. If you want to duplicate, you can right click it and duplicate, and you can create another one over here. You can change the color of the lights. That, and that's where we'll get into that with scenes and stuff. Know that this is in rendered mode. In material mode, you can turn the lights on. If you right click over here, here's your lights. You can turn them on. The difference is you get the option to turn on the world and the light. So separate from each other. So like there can be a world light, which can be an image or this type of equirectangular type. Notice that as I change these, the lighting on these objects change. It's getting its light from this rendered sphere. Um, and this is great for like compositing things uh, onto like tables or in 3D if you want to composite something or make it look like it fits on a photograph or in the background of something. You use these equirectangular images to do that. And then add your own light sources to do whatever. So that's the lights. That's this scene setup selection. The other thing to know about this is you can group things by collections. So then you can select them. So if I wanted to say the scene collection is going to be everything, if I wanted to make and just kind of group my camera and lights into their own collection, I can move to collection, right click, move to collection, say new, and call this camera lights. Okay. And now I've got a new collection over here, which is the camera and lights. I've moved these objects into it. I could drag things into it. And then I could call these like, let's say I wanted to make a collection for spheres and then make another collection. I did another one here called cubes. And then I wanted to just drag my cubes into that one and my sphere into this one and my cone as well. So now I've got things split out and organized so that what if I've got a complex scene and I just want to work on part of it? I can turn off parts. Okay. So if I wanted to move this plane outside into the main scene so that it just sits out by itself, when I turn off spheres, the plane stays and the cubes are there. I can turn off the camera and lights, which isn't super useful because I'm trying to render with cameras and lights. But you can do that if you need to, because sometimes this stuff can cause your machine, depending on how powerful it is, to bog down a little bit. So just be aware. So with all of that, the only thing that's really left to cover is these things that you'll see me using every now and then, but we're going to get into that as I actually start to do the modeling. And I'm probably going to save this as a separate video, which will just be the intro part. But the only thing that we didn't cover in this is this little tool, this tab right here, which is called the Object Properties tab. And it's not just object properties, it's everything's properties. So there's a tool, whatever tool you have selected, its properties will show up over here. So if I select this arrow selection tool, you'll see it changed this tool option over here. If I change this, it changes. So every single tool in Blender, whatever is selected, its properties will show up in this little screwdriver / wrench icon, which is the tool properties tab. Okay. And that's going to just always be over here under this little tab option here in this editor. This is the properties tab, and you can pull it up anywhere. It falls under data properties, but by default, it's going to be over here, and it doesn't go away depending on what tab you're on. It just stays over here. Okay. And you're going to use it a lot. So that's the tools. Here is your render setting. And by default, now we are rendering in Eevee. I'll go into the other renderers later. And then there's the scene format or the output format, which is properties, which is how do you want to render this thing? In this case, 1920 by 1080, which would be HD, and there's all kinds of others. You can go 4K. How many frames per second for an animation, which frames to render, where's the output folder, what kind of files, what kind of format, all that stuff. Okay. Um, and then here is the view layer properties, which is, excuse me, this is what we are actually in over here. I call this the scene. Notice that this icon, these little layered images, it's the same as this icon, because right now my display mode for this editor, this outliner, this is called the outliner tab. My display mode is set for view layer. And that means what I'm looking at is the view, which in this case is the entire scene. But there's other ways to look at this, like scenes, because you can have multiple scenes and it looks different. By default, I usually just stay in the view layer. Okay. But this will change. This part will change how this view layer is split up into options. So if I wanted to be able to see, in this case, the Z value or the Z depth of this view layer by clicking on and enabling this, I can, under render pass here now, go and see. Maybe I can only enable that in cycles. I'm not sure. It's probably when I actually click render. If I go render here and I render my image, in this case I rendered it with Eevee. Here's the options for the output. And there's going to be this layered. Notice I've got combined and depth. The depth is the Z that I enabled there. So if I go and I turn off under my layer there, if I turn off Z and render again, under view layer, I only have view layer. Okay. So you can, what this is useful for is like you can render a bunch of different things and then combine them back together later. So I can render just a light pass, diffuse light, specular light, volume light, emission, because I can make things glow. I'll get into that. I just want to explain all these properties. So these, then there's two more here that are not specific to objects. The rest of them after that will be specific to whatever object is selected. So the next one is the scene properties. So this is like for setting up, like what's the scene camera, what's the background of the scene. I'll show you another way to get at that. What are the units of the scene, which matters if you're going to export these things to a game engine. Whether or not we're using gravity, because we can do physics stuff. The simulation range, because we can do physics stuff. Key sets, blah, blah, blah. A lot of things that we're not going to go into that have to do with animation. And then there's the world settings. So in the world settings, there's two ways to get at this as well. You'll notice by default, I've got this grid here, and you'll notice that the sky on this thing is kind of gray. That's this color right here, which is the background color right now. So if I wanted to make it white, I could do that, but realize that that is contributing to the lighting using the scene world of the scene. So I'm literally saying the whole environment is white, and that's a light source, and it will wash out. I turn this on, it'll wash out the render because it's like the sky. It's like you're in the middle of a foggy, overly lit scene with a lot of light and everything. All the shadows will disappear. They're there barely, but they're getting washed out because you're getting this light coming from everywhere. So by default, realize when it comes in and it's this dark gray, it doesn't seem like that's doing anything, but it's actually adding the equivalent of an ambient light. So if you turn off the scene lights, that's why you can still see the plane and these cubes and stuff, because this is adding a little bit of light to the scene. If I crank that up, notice it brightens it up. It's the amount of that light gray color that's kind of overblowing it. So if you wanted to go just completely black with no ambient light, then you literally go completely black, no ambient light, and now you don't see anything. You can see the grid, and you can kind of see the outline of the boxes against the grid. But render wise, if you turn the lights off, there's no lighting. So uh, just realize that this color is adding something to your scene. Um, if you're going to render. Um, and it's fine. A little bit of ambient light is useful because uh, light bounces around in rooms, and there's no true black in something unless it's completely cut off from the outside world. So that's part of the reason for this. We can change this later in the shading setups, and we can actually use one of these uh, world lights, image base lights, that's tied to the world, and create our own lighting setup depending on whatever we want it to be. And I'll show that later as well. And then that would actually contribute the light from whatever that scene is. Here, I'll just go ahead and show you that real quick just to give you a little tasty of it. So right now I just clicked on shading mode, and that's where you can go in and select an object and see what its shader node graph looks like. Like this guy, which is a shader, and you can pump a whole bunch of stuff into that using adding extra nodes. There's a lot. I won't go into that until later, but I'll show you the gist of it. Because what we're going to do is right now we're looking at the object shader node. There's a world shader node. Notice that it looks like our world icon over here. Pull that. Here's our gray color piped in right here. This is it. And what we can do is we can add a texture, environment texture, this guy. And I just happen to have a bunch. Let me go to my E drive. It'd be under this. And I've just resorted all of my stuff, so I have to figure out where I put it. It's hard to remember because I used to have everything sorted differently. That it would be global textures here. Environment HDRs. HDR is what you want because it's got more lighting information baked in. Show you, these are equirectangular images. So let's say if I wanted it to look like it's this, I like sunsets a lot, so I'm going to go with this kind of dark, pinkish sunset. Yeah, let's do that one. And that image connects the color output here to that, and nothing changes, right? Because we don't have our world turned on. Now we have our world turned on, and there's the environment texture that I just added. And if you look at it, in render mode, let's turn off the lights. The light source should be coming brightest from this side. I can crank this thing up, and it will create shadows from that. Now, it's an overall kind of lighting, and these things won't necessarily kind of add that much light, but you can see that the source of the light that it's lighting this face, I've got my lights turned off. It's getting its light where it's coming from. It's not showing it completely because we're not in cycles, which would actually, if I go into that, renders with some global illumination, and you'll see where there's like shadows coming from that light source, and it's getting bounce lighting and things like that. We'll go into that later, but for now, just stay in Eevee because it's quick and easy to work with. All right. I think that's it for, well, actually, let's keep talking about these tabs. Sorry, there's a lot, but I want you to know Blender in terms of the layout before we get into the actual modeling part. So that was the last of our kind of global stuff. Now, the next tab here under Properties is the Object Properties tab, and that's where you'll notice that I went when I was animating. You start with this object transform, the relationships, like whether or not an object is parented to another object. So if I wanted to parent this cube to this cube for animation purposes, or just so that I can move one and it would move with it, I can select this and then click on this one. Now they move together, whereas this can still move separate, right? So you can kind of set up these planetary relationships. I'm going to undo that. Another way to do it, you notice that when I did the tab select and it snapped into place, it's because it took its parent's transform by default instead of keeping the one that it had relative. So if you select, go select, shift, click, and then right click and hit parent, and then clear. You don't want to clear, you want to parent the object. Now it keeps that relationship relative to where it was already. So that's another way to do a parent. We'll get into that later. What else you got here? Collections. Which collections is it in? Instancing. Won't go into that. There's not a whole lot more there. And then you get into modifiers. All right, so if we select this object, these are we're going to cover in modeling as well. But I just want to explain. Modifiers are basically procedural ways to edit the shape of something without doing it permanently. So if you add a modifier, and let's say we want to make a bunch of these cubes like a step, we could do an array modifier. So we've got to generate array. And by default, it's going to just do this second cube, right? And we want to, you'll notice it's animated it one off. So it's taking its scale, animating it on the X by that. We could do it on the Y, right? Or if we wanted to make steps, we could do it on the Z. And we could make a whole bunch of steps, right? All the way to heaven. Now, the cool thing about this is I've got this array. What if I wanted to do edit the width of these? I don't have to edit all of these. I can just edit the one, click R, and scale, and all the others follow, right? So, and then when I'm done, I can apply it. I'll have these steps, but you can do it in a way that tweaks it. You can get it to fit, the steps to fit the shape that you want to make just by doing the array on a single cube and then positioning it relative to where you want it to be. So like if we really wanted to do this accurately, you'll notice that it's scaling relative to the center of the cube because that's where its origin was set. But if I want to go and edit that and scale it relative to the floor, I can go up here under options, which is a little tab right under our render options here, and just select origins. And then if I hit this and move it down, we'll click on this little Y here to see it from the side and just line it up at the bottom like that. I won't show you how snapping works yet, but so now I've moved its origin down to the base of that cube so that when I scale it, it stays on the floor. And it's just growing from that floor to whatever height we want it to go to based on however many steps we want it to go. Okay. On top of that, we can actually keep adding modifiers to it. So if we wanted to add a second array modifier, just to be crazy, we can make steps on steps. So what that'll do then is down here under the second array, we can offset it because now it's going to be doing its offset relative to the entire width that we had of the other steps. So we can position something like that. And this is redundant and stupid what I'm doing, but you get the idea. So that you can make extra steps that are slightly offset from the other, and you can do that ad infinitum in that direction that way if you want. So you can start to make like roof tiles or shingles or whatever, bricks in a wall. The other thing you can do that's cool with this is you can do an object offset. All right, so let's take this cube. And we're going to take our array, instead of making it a relative offset, let's make it an object offset, and then select this cube as our reference for the object. So now, see what happens here. If I rotate that cube, see where I'm getting this weird transform. And it's specific to how this object relates to this object's origin. So if you put it at the origin, let me set it to 0 again. 0, 0, 0. My rotation, 0, 0. Okay. And then we just need to put it relative to. So basically, I'm trying to get these origin points lined up because I really just want to do it with the rotation, not with the. Because you can, yeah, there we go. And then what you can do is if you rotate that, scale it. You can create these weird parabolic shapes of steps. It's more useful for creating like spiral stairs. But like I said, that's a way you can do a spiral staircase if you wanted. I didn't do the setup right for this, but I just wanted to kind of give you the hint that you can get really trippy and weird quick with these kinds of setups. That's modifiers. We'll get into all the different modifiers later. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them. There's particles. If you wanted to add a particle emitter to it, there are force fields for creating physics effects like tornadoes for particles. Constraints, which you would use for animation purposes so that things can be constrained in terms of rotation or bones or things like that. These are the another useful function, which is the parts of this object, the vertices, right? So in other words, let me get rid of this modifier. Right now, this cube, if you look at it, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 vertices. Okay. I want to call out these vertices and make them into a group. To do that, you would select them, go over here under this little triangular vertex connected dot thing, and you'll see an option called vertex groups, and you can click on plus and call it four right verts. Could be left verts because I'm looking, it doesn't, depends on which way you're looking at it, but we want to just give it a name. Okay, and then we can assign, and now those are part of, if we do select, it'll only select those verts. So it's good for selection sets. You can make one called 4 left verts. Assign those. So what that means then is we've got these two selection vertex groups, sets, right? I could use them to select, but also too, we can call them out in modifiers. So if I go back out of edit mode and I put a modifier on this guy, let's do I don't have like I'm using something that's relatively low res, so it's not super useful in this respect, but let's do generate, and we will do a decimate. So right now, a decimate, I've got a ratio. Decimate's useful for when you've got like a really, really high res, lots of polys thing, and you want to get it low poly. And you can do that with this decimate. So if I take this down, you notice it's removing vertices as I go, okay? So I literally just made it into 1, 2, 3, 4 triangles instead of, or I can go down to even less, to a single triangle. And that's what decimation does. It's to take something and reduce it, okay? Notice this vertex group option here. If I select my 4 right verts, it will only decimate those, or the 4 left verts, it'll only decimate those. So it's a way of selectively applying this modifier by using the vertex group option. That's where vertex groups come in handy. Besides that, there's UV maps, which we'll get into later. It's the way you apply textures wrapped around this object. Color attributes, if we wanted to apply those. Normals, which we could, let me give you an example of normals here. So right now we've got this square, right? And it's set to, it shows up as a square because these hard edges. It doesn't have to do that. If we did a sphere, I've got a sphere in here, don't I? Here, notice that our sphere isn't necessarily super sphere-y because it's got hard edges, right? That's because by default, it's not set to shade smooth. If I set it to shade smooth, now it looks more sphere-like. You can see along the edges that it's got less polys, so it's got these polygonal edges. But it is set to shade smooth, and that's because the normals, or the breaking angle. But let's say we wanted to make it only be sharp at certain angles. Because it's a sphere, it's not great. But what if we squeeze this a little bit so that we want this thing to have kind of an edge or a hard crease on the edge, okay? What you can do is squeeze that, and then under right click and say shade auto smooth, and then down here under the normals, there's our auto smooth. If I crank that down, you see where the angles start to crease, because this is the angle of one face to another that creates that hard edge. And because there's so many shapes to this, or so many faces, it doesn't show up easily. But you can see where I can control that using this breaking angle. Going back to our box, what if I didn't want it to be a box? I just wanted it to be like box shape but render smooth. I can do that. So if I do shade smooth, this is what that looks like. Looks very strange because the normals are very extreme. There's not enough faces to create like a good normal. But that's what it would look like. Can do shade auto smooth, and that's where, again, all of these edges are going to be a 90-degree normal. So if I crank this up to 89, 88, 89, it's going to look fine. If I go over 90, it goes and breaks because it's got past the breaking normal, right? And that's where it changes. Does it seem useful? It's actually very useful, because what if you wanted some things on an object to be smooth and then some things to be sharp? So let's say we want these faces and these faces to be like an eye or something like that. I'm going to pull them in and then pull them in that way. And then maybe take these, scale them. This a nose, extruding it. Let's scale that down. All right, let's go back out. So you can see our hard edges starting to render. What if we just wanted, I'm gonna turn on my X symmetry here. I think I'm on the X, we'll see. Nope, I'm not, it's B, Y. Oop, must be Z. May not even have symmetry, I don't. I've done something that's thrown the symmetry off, but we'll get into that for modeling in the next video. But I don't have to be perfect here. All right. Let's call that an eye. It's not great, but going back to our normals here, I want it to be round like a face, and you get the hint of a face. Smooth, it's kind of chunky, but now I want to add back in my creases to, let's say I want this top part here, these edges, to be sharp. I can right click and mark sharp. And now I get that back. And if I wanted to have like this, double clicking on these to select contiguous lines, I can mark sharp. And you can see where you start to get like the smooth, sharp interplay. And that'll come in handy for when you want to do, like on our robot later, when we want to create a smooth surface, but then have some hard-edged creases or grooves where it's kind of parts connected together. So that's where this breaking angle comes in useful. It's like make it completely smooth and then go back in and add hard edges. There's other ways to do that too. We'll get into that. All right, so we talked about materials. There's a lot more to them. We'll get into that. And then the next one is textures. And this is really textures for brushes, not textures for materials. You can add those in the shader factor, or they'll be accessed through if you add a texture here. This texture is really meant more for controlling the way a tool like a paintbrush or something, or a displacement map can work. We'll get into that. So that's it. So you've seen there's a viewport here. That's us manipulating this guy. Here's our properties panel. Here's our outliner. Here's our tools for manipulating things. In this case, not much because we're in object mode, but if I was in edit mode, then if we hit edits, then we get a lot of tools over here. And we'll explain all of those when I go to model later. these are your, in edit mode, you can select by vertex, edge, and face, and we'll be going through doing all of that because each one of these tools behaves differently depending on how you do that. And then in sculpt mode, you see how you get different tools for doing different things. Like I wanted to grab this and pull this nose long, I can just do it in kind of this global destructive way where it sort of becomes like rubber. Okay. Vertex paint we won't get into, white paint we won't get into until we do actual rigging. Texture paint we might get into when we do some material stuff. You can see when I'm in sculpt mode, you see where the symmetry is at because I'm looking at X symmetry. What's going on is you see how I select a dot, it expects it to be across the origin. So if I go back, because this thing is offset right here, if I go object, apply, location, actually that object transform, and then set origin to geometry. I'll put it in the center. Now we've got this in the center. If I go and edit sculpt, notice that my symmetry is applied again to the object. So based on what I've selected here. So if I want to just do Y symmetry, I can do that. That's because he's facing this green line here is along the Y. That's where the symmetry. So if I wanted to do X, there isn't any X symmetry right now, but it'll do its best to do it. And that would be across the front and the back. All right. So we talked about the different modes. We'll get into these later. These are just menus specific to each mode, so you'll see how they change relative to that. These are sort of transform options relative to what you're doing. So right now I've got this thing set for local in terms of its movement. So if I go and I rotate it like this, the axis stays relative to the object, so I can move it along that axis. I set it to global, which is its normal default. You'll notice that I don't get that option to move it relative to the way its nose is pointing. It's based on the world axis. If I do it based on normal, it goes back to that, but what that really is based on its like face normal. So if I was in edit mode, notice that the normal on this guy is relative to that face's angle, whereas if I set it to local, notice I can pull it this way. I go to normal, I pull it out from its face, its actual normal. Anyway, we'll get into that later. So I think that's it for now. So hopefully that gives you a good introduction into the Blender windows and layouts and how to manipulate things. Remember, number one for this is industry compatible Keymap. So again, if you go under Edit, Preferences, select industry compatible, or when you first install Blender, it's going to say, do you want to use something? If you've already had Blender installed, do you want to use the previous stuff? It'll use whatever you selected there, or you'll literally get the option to choose these in the first, before you open an actual new scene or whatever. It'll ask you which way do you want to work with it. I choose industry compatible because I learned with industry compatible keys, and to be honest, Blender keys drive me crazy. It might be in your interest later to go back and learn Blender keys because there's a lot more, like I said, that you can do with them. They are very different from the industry compatible keys. Um, so you're not going to learn them from me, but you can learn them somewhere else doing other tutorials. And you can go online and you'll see sheets of these, or you can just come in here and study what does what. So if you wanted to say, under 3D view, which is this guy, the 3D view global, here's my screencast keys option. So if I hit Shift Alt C, then that would bring that up. For object mode, object mode global, I've got a bunch of installed add-ons and stuff like ZenViewV and all of that. We might get into those later, but like insert keyframe, Shift W, that would be might be a different key for the non-industry compatible. So stick with industry compatible if you're going to follow this tutorial. The other thing to know is add-ons here. When we go into the next video, I'll go through the process of showing you the image installing or importing images as planes. But I think it may not be installed by default, but it's an option and you just need to enable it, and that'll give you the ability to import your reference images. All right, for now I'm going to save this because this is long enough, and then I'll make another video later of the modeling.